I created a survey for the community to rank 30 standard format deck archetypes by tier. Tier 0 being the absolute best, and Tier 4 being borderline unplayable. I received 200 responses ranking all 30 decks, giving me a substantial amount of data that I believe removes outliers and will produce an accurate representation of how the community perceives the viability and relevance of each of these decks in the Lost Origin standard format of the Pokemon trading card game. In this video, we will start all the way down at Tier 4 and work our way up to the best decks and format decided by people in the community. This survey used availability sampling, which is not known for its external validity, but for this project, I believe it was good enough for the preliminary trials of this type of content, which I could always improve upon for future installments. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for daily Pokemon TCG content. Now let's get into the community tier list for the Lost Origin standard format of the Pokemon trading card game. Due to the nature of this survey, it would have taken almost all 200 respondents rating a deck as Tier 4 or Tier 0 for any decks to show up as a perfect Tier 0 or Tier 4 deck. With that in mind, we won't have any decks between the Tier 3.5 and 4 range with this data set, but our lowest ranked deck at number 30 with an average of a 3.47 tier score is the Swim Freely DEWGONG deck. And I think it's rightfully so that this is the lowest ranked deck by the community, since it's not even listed as an archetype on the Play.Limitless TCG decks section, but this deck involves using the new Finneon with the Swim Freely ability paired with the new Dewgong from Lost Origins using its Flow Return attack, and kind of building it like a Rapid Strike Malamar style deck. Speaking of Rapid Strike Malamar, moving up to 3.235 as its average score, Rapid Strike Malamar will also be falling into this range between 3 and 3.5 as the 29th ranked deck. Moving up to essentially being ranked as a solid tier 3 is ARCEUS Charizard VMAX, combining the consistency and efficiency of ARCEUS VSTAR with the raw power of Charizard VMAX, also getting to choose one of two very powerful Fire Radiant Pokemon, Heatran or Charizard. And right above that is ironically a water-based deck, Rapid Strike INTELEON VMAX, which focuses on tanking and healing and doing moderate amounts of damage turn after turn until you win a war of attrition versus decks that cannot one-shot Rapid Strike INTELEON VMAX. Moving into the tier 2 and 2.5 range, we're going to be seeing a lot more decks that you'll probably recognize. The first one here at an average score of 2.675 is VIKAVOLT V. Now, VIKAVOLT V did just come back onto the scene recently, which I think if this survey was taken maybe a few days after the Limitless Showdown instead of the weekend during the Limitless Showdown, maybe VIKAVOLT V would have gotten a little bit of a higher score, because it is very good at item locking these Lost Zone engines that play so many items in their deck, but it can struggle against cards like KYUREM and GIRATINA VSTAR and ARCEUS-based decks that can set up a lot of large attackers that VIKAVOLT V has an issue dealing with. Right above that at a score of 2.63 is BLISSEY MILTANK. BLISSEY MILTANK actually got second at Milwaukee Regionals, and it is a real deck, so to speak. But MILTANK is getting a lot less value right now, it seems, with decks playing Empoleon V and just a plethora of single prize attackers around, so that MILTANK cannot wall out as many decks successfully. But I still think BLISSEY V is a very strong attacker when it goes unchecked. At 2.56 is ARCEUS Jolteon Memory Capsules, which this is a deck I think could make an appearance at Peoria Regional Championships or SLC, because PALKIA Inteleon and KYUREM Palkia are both very strong and both very reliant on water abilities, which Jolteon from Vivid Voltage shuts down. Conveniently, the community ranked URSHIFU Inteleon and Rapid Strike URSHIFU with Lost Zone Engine exactly the same down to the third decimal point of 2.425. Kind of just saying, if it's Rapid Strike Urshifu, this is where I think it is. I think everybody knows Rapid Strike Urshifu has the potential to be included in some convoluted deck list piloted by a mastermind player and beat just about anything in its path as long as prizes don't absolutely ruin their game plan. But with that being said, I don't think it has the raw power compared to a lot of the decks above it in the tier 2 and tier 1 range. It could be played, it could do well, I just don't think it's expected to. Above that is GOODRA VSTAR ARCEUS at a 2.34 rating, so we're really getting into the ratings that are much higher and closer to the tier 2 range. And taking a look at those tier definitions again, these tier 2 decks are things that people expect can break into the top 64, 32, 16, top 8 range in major events. GOODRA VSTAR ARCEUS is kind of like ARCEUS DURALUDON, but you can play the Radiant Gardevoir and have a different prize mapping that you force your opponent into to take 6 prize cards, knocking out 3 V-Stars. And if they go for the Radiant Gardevoir, it just makes that much harder for them because then they have to essentially take a 7th prize card. This is something ARCEUS DURALUDON can't really do with the Radiant Gardevoir because that just makes the opponent's prize mapping a lot easier for them if they choose to go and target down the Gardevoir. Right above that is control variants, mostly speaking about the Mewtwo V Union, but really anything using this core with the Snorlax, the Galarian Meowth, the Miltanks, the Pukumuku, that kind of general engine that we saw premiered by Sander Wojcik at the North American International Championships. Probably still using Mewtwo V Union if it's seen, having a solid 2.3 ranking here. And right above that, we've got Ice Rider, CALYREX, VMAX variants with PALKIA, with KYUREM, with INTELEON, with BIBAREL, whatever you choose to play it with. I do think it's getting overshadowed by KYUREM VMAX a lot, but it doesn't necessarily make it invalid. Ice Rider, CALYREX, VMAX is going to be much more efficient at knocking out 280 HP Pokemon because it only takes 2 energy to do that and can just rebuild itself with an attachment and Melanie every turn, not needing abilities, where KYUREM is a little bit more vulnerable to Path to the Peaks. Next is ARCEUS BIBAREL variants, not including the Giratina Flying Pikachu variant. So these are going to be things more along the lines of like ARCEUS Ice Rider, ARCEUS Aggron VMAX, ARCEUS Aegislash VMAX, things that we've seen around but aren't exactly fully archetypes on their own. They're kind of like ARCEUS BIBAREL plus a partner. So I think these decks are aptly rated here at the 2.16 range. And above that is DIALGA VSTAR. Now, DIALGA VSTAR, I think, has a lot of potential, especially the way we saw it played to a top 4 in the Limitless Showdown with the Lost Zone engine. I think Thornton also gives DIALGA VSTAR a lot of potential to build this Dialga out of nowhere and then take your extra turn with the VSTAR attack and then knock something out with your first attack. I think DIALGA VSTAR has the potential to go far, go the distance in a regional championships, and there's not a lot you can do to prepare for a deck like this if it's setting up consistently. CRAMORANT Articuno is going to be just roughly a little worse than tier 2 at tier 0.095. This deck is a more simple version of the Lost Zone boxes that you'll be seeing, focusing on using CRAMORANT as the main attacker, which attacks for free as long as you have 4 cards in the Lost Zone, and then Articuno from the Pokemon Go TCG expansion that buffs the attacks of water Pokemon by 10. So if you have 4 of these Articunos down, CRAMORANT would be doing 150 instead of its base of 110. So the goal is to have a couple or a few Articunos down each turn while you're attacking with CRAMORANTs, and using the Lost Zone engine to get you through your deck, and just be very consistent since your main attacker needs 0 energy, but the power level of the deck kind of caps out at a level that not many people are too happy with, which is why it's down here just below tier 2 and not higher in relation to how consistent it is. Just doesn't have the power level to match. The other GOODRA VSTAR variant is the Lost Zone GOODRA VSTAR with Comfey, Colress's Experiment, sometimes Fantina. This is going to have the community score of 2.05, so solidly a tier 2 deck. This is ranked higher than the ARCEUS variant of GOODRA VSTAR, and I think they're both good. They both have different strengths. Of course, the GOODRA VSTAR with Comfey variant can use Mirage Gates and Fantina, so then you can have attackers like Radiant Greninja being useful, whereas the Arceus GOODRA variant uses the Radiant Gardevoir, doesn't use any of the Lost Zone shenanigans. So I think players are valuing the ability to use the Lost Zone stuff in this variant and not in the Arceus variant, which is probably why it is being left higher than the Arceus variant. But if people are countering the Lost Zone stuff with things like Empoleon and things like VIKAVOLT V, then the Arceus variant actually seems a little bit better in that case. Our first deck in the ones is Arceus Duraludon with an average rating of 1.97, so it's, again, roughly a tier 2 deck, just a little bit above according to the community. Arceus Duraludon is still doing its same thing. It's, you know, we got Starburst for the cards we need to make Trinity Nova to a Duraludon happen, and then try to force the opponent through 2 Duraludon VMAXs. It's very linear, it's kind of boring, but it gets the job done sometimes, and it does have good matchups like the Regigigas, and it's pretty good against smaller damage output decks like that Cramorant deck we were talking about, like the Lost Box decks, because this also uses healing with Crystal Cave and Hyper Potion. Sometimes they even play a Charon's Care for the Arceus itself and not for the Duraludon. So still a solid deck, but not breaking into the top 10. Inteleon Radiant Charizard / Inteleon Counters is going to be just above that at 1.965. And Radiant Charizard and Inteleon won Baltimore Regionals, but things change quickly here with the Lost Origin set coming into play due to the Lost City Stadium that can send a Pokemon to the Lost Zone when it's knocked out. So players are very afraid to have just one copy of a Radiant Charizard as their attacker in a field where people could be playing Lost Cities, and we already know people are playing Lost Cities in decks like Mew VMAX, which was a very favorable matchup for the Inteleon Zard deck, but now with Lost City around, that's not the case any longer. This deck is still good, but has things to be afraid of now. Other single prize decks that can potentially outpace it or do a larger variety of things. So I think the deck is still solid, but I don't think it's anywhere near the top of the format where it was just weeks ago in Baltimore. HISUIAN ZOROARK VSTAR getting a rating of 1.85 from the community. I don't think this card is that great, and I don't think the archetype is that great. I'll settle for it being somewhere around tier 2. I just have not been impressed by it. I know a lot of people are attracted to its very high damage output starting on turn 2. But I don't really have much else to say for this one. The community seems to like it at least a decent amount. Next is PALKIA BIBAREL, which was played by Tord Reklev to Baltimore Regionals. I don't think he did too great with it, but whenever Tord plays a deck, people respect it and give it the chance, and sometimes even overrate it a little bit. Now, this deck is very consistent, but Tord said in a tweet it had 10 out of 10 consistency and pray emoji out of 10 power level. Which I think is like the opposite of Palkia and Inteleon, which has 10 out of 10 power level and pray you don't have a Manaphy attached pass. So this is essentially if you like Palkia but don't like the inconsistent starts of Palkia and Inteleon or all of the different routes to keep track of, and you'd want a more streamlined approach to Palkia, then I think that's what this deck does, but I worry that it doesn't do it better than KYUREM Palkia. Breaking into the top 10 decks, starting with a rating of 1.725 from the community, is Regigigas. Regigigas got a few new tools from Lost Origin, those being Gift Energy and Thornton, mostly. but I think that most competitive lists have decided to omit the Thornton because they need cards to prepare for counters like Empoleon. So they're putting more Path to the Peaks, more Gusts, more things like that. And then the gift energy really helps when the opponent would normally Marnie or Roxanne and then knock out your active. If you've got a gift energy in the active, which you can accelerate with Regigigas, it makes a large difference. So Regigigas' power level is pretty good right now. I mean, it got top 4 in Baltimore. It did really well at Worlds as well. Obviously, that was pre-Lost Origin, but the deck gained a new card or two, and I think it's a bit off of people's radar. People are really trying to counter Lost Box and Giratina and Palkia and KYUREM and Mew, and Regigigas isn't even on their radar right now. At a rating of 1.56 is my personal favorite, ARCEUS INTELEON. ARCEUS INTELEON got some new cards with Lost Origin as well, Radiant Gardevoir and Lake Acuity being two of them that I'm commonly seeing included in lists right now. I think ARCEUS INTELEON has a really good matchup spread. It's good against the single prize Lost Box decks. It can tech for pretty much everything from Big Parasol to Better Combat Giratina VSTAR, extra paths, and hand disruption to disrupt the KYUREM Palkia and also the Lost Box decks. And then you can also play Drapion V to counter Mew VMAX if you wish. So ARCEUS INTELEON is even more versatile than ever before, I think. And in a metagame where people aren't really thinking about it when they're building their decks and thinking about it when they're calculating their matchup spreads, this deck is creeping back up into relevancy quite fast. And just above that is Arceus, Giratina, Pika. So Flying Pikachu, Giratina V-Star, Arceus, BIBAREL, some combination of these cards. It can have Giratina or Pika or both, is the way I worded it on the tier list survey. This is a strong deck, just like the Arceus Pika decks that won NAIC and the ones that won Worlds, and it doesn't have that same satisfying consistent Arceus feel to me that Arceus INTELEON does, because you're still playing with fire here, hoping that the Bibarels draw you enough cards to see what you need, and hoping that your attackers are strong enough, and in lieu of having Roxanne's and Charon Care and things like that, and tutored options on demand with the Inteleons. But this deck does offer better turn 1 starts, more bursty draw power, and more bursty amounts of damage, with the Giratina doing 280 prior to any damage modifiers. So it's no surprise that people think this is a strong deck. Next at 1.095, so less than a tenth of a score away from being a perfect 1, is Mew with POKESTOPS. Mew with POKESTOPS, according to many, dominated Baltimore. It was a very, very successful deck in Baltimore, and I think this deck is really strong, much stronger than people thought it was going to be in Lost Origin. I would not have thought this weeks ago, but now I think Mew POKESTOPS is potentially one of the best plays for Peoria, the first Lost Origins regional championship. So Mew POKESTOPS, very, very strong, especially this first place list from the Limitless Showdown playing a Roxanne and a Path. This deck has kind of everything in it, while it's also just a beat stick with Mew in the active. So definitely prepare yourself for this one if you're going to events this weekend. And it's no surprise that the community has rated this so high. Next, our last one with the number 1 in its rating prior to the decimal is going to be Mew with Fusion Strike energies, the classic Mew VMAX build, at an average rating of 1.01. Mew Fusion Strike does have some positives that the Mew POKESTOPS doesn't have. For example, it doesn't mind going first or second because it can take knockouts going second on its first turn, whereas Mew POKESTOPS cannot achieve that. At a rating of 0.96 is Lost Box variants with Radiant Greninja. These will also be accompanied by Mirage Gates, typically using Cramorant as the early game attackers, and then having a myriad of options like Radiant Greninja, Sableye, sometimes Crabominable V, Raikou V, or Zeraora, and things like that you'll see in this deck list from the Singapore Regional Championships that happened recently in the Lost Origin format. And speaking of Lost Box, at 0.85 is Lost Box with Radiant Charizard. These lists will typically not include Mirage Gate, and they are focused heavily on Cramorant and Sableye and Charizard. That is the game plan. Use those three attackers in their best scenarios and use them as efficiently as possible to get the most amount of damage on the board. And a lot of times you're winning with Cleanup Crew Sableye, just knocking out things left and right on the bench in the active wherever you need it to, with the Lost Mine attack, placing 12 damage counters wherever, and Charizard does 250 damage, so that's pretty good too. No surprise that players are rating it this highly. This deck has been popping off between the Yokohama Championships and our online events, and a lot of top players piloting it in these online events and praising it very highly, so I expect this to be super popular for Peoria, and then we'll see what happens after that, but for now the community said that it is better than a tier 1 deck. We have a few more that the community said are better than tier 1. The next one being KYUREM Palkia, just above the Lost Box Radiant Zard. KYUREM Palkia is a solid deck. It kind of reminds me of the power level of playing Buzzwole Lycanroc back when Buzzwole Lycanroc was pretty new. I'm not saying it's as good as Buzzrock was, but you have multiple options of different attackers. You even have a single prize attacker in Radiant Greninja. I really like these decks with the 1, 2, and 3 prize attackers going on. And KYUREM VMAX has 330 HP, and it can do infinite amount of damage. Palkia VSTAR pairs with it very well. We have so much water support. We've got Bucket, we've got Greninja, we've got Irida. The Guru goes well with it, Rotom Phone. This deck has so much going for it, and it's pretty darn smooth. In the early game, the mid game, the late game, the one thing I'll say about it is those Roxanne paths hurt it in the late game, and sometimes it's hard to find a boss when you need it. But other than that, this deck is very well rounded. Above that, at a 0.775, and I'm surprised this is the second highest rated deck on our community tier list, is Giratina V-Star with Comfey. Now, the reason I'm surprised is because players have been saying this deck is hard to play and hard to perfect and hard to evaluate how we need to build it for this early metagame. So with the Lost Box decks seeing more success than Giratina has been, I expected them to be rated higher than Giratina, but I think these players rating it this high are seeing the potential in Giratina and not what it's actually performing right now. So I think people have high hopes for Giratina V-Star Comfey, and that's kind of the wild card on this tier list, I think, is that Giratina V-Star Comfey got rated so highly, even though it's been seeing less success and less confidence than the other decks. And finally, the highest rated deck at a 0.5 is Palkia Inteleon. Palkia Inteleon is still very, very good. Its early turn is what really bothers me. Sometimes you don't get your board established and you really have to fight through it, but the same can be said for a lot of Inteleon engine decks and even some non-Inteleon engine decks. But what Palkia Inteleon does have is options. It can cross-switcher, it can cancel in Cologne, Roxanne, Marnie, Path. Sometimes they're playing Training Court or Collapse Stadium or Temple of Sinnoh. There's so much going on. You have your Radiant Greninja. Some players are using Empoleon V in the deck. It's almost like a toolbox style deck, but the toolbox part are the trainers and the items, supporters, stadiums. They aren't really the Pokemon. Although you do have some great attackers between Palkia, Greninja, and Inteleon. This deck is very powerful. The consistency isn't what I would love it to be, but I think it would be near unbeatable if it was a little more consistent. And so, yeah, Palkia V-Star taking the very top place on our tier list. And here I'll give you guys a look on the screen of the tier list built into a real tier list. Here we've been using the number line for the whole video, but now constructed into one conglomerate tier list. This is the community tier list for Lost Origin leading into Peoria Regionals. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This was a blast to make, and I loved going through all of the data and putting it together for you guys, all the visuals and numbers and everything. So hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know what you think about it in the comments down below. Subscribe to the channel for daily daily Pokemon TCG content, check out all my sponsors in the description and links as well. And I'll see you next time here on Celio's Network.